Jazakumullah khair. Maybe, brother, you want to like recap what we discussed last time, like in few minutes, briefly, so that any person joining first time can get some ideas, and then you can start from there.
Yeah, inshallah. Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So, as you probably can tell from the title, the discussion has been primarily about mortgages and other types of transactions that involve interest and their permissibility. So to sum up some of what has been discussed is that, in essence, the issue revolves around two things. One is to understand what is riba from a Sharia perspective. What exactly are those transactions that are considered riba in the Sharia? And number two is also the differences of opinions amongst some of the fuqaha about when and where riba can be used. So the first issue is based upon the actual usage of the word in the Quran itself. Okay, so obviously we know that the Sharia, the source of it is first and foremost revelation. And that's an important point because I will come back to that point later on. And the reasoning behind that is because basically a lot of the things that I've seen that were given to me, particularly about this issue of riba, there seems to be some kind of disconnect in the thought process of many people who write about this subject. That is that they're not really well grounded in our tradition to understand how do we source law. And so basically what I'm saying is that as Muslims, we must first of all appreciate our epistemology, that is that how we conclude things and where do we take our knowledge from? What are the means and methodologies of deriving knowledge? And to recap this, because I've said this in many classes before, and please bear with me and be patient because all of this is very pertinent, that our epistemology, what's called asbabul ilm, according to some theologians, meaning these are the means in which created things, which is a very important clause there, that created things can acquire knowledge. They are in essence summarized in three ways, there are three things that we use, if you will. There are three ways in which we can acquire knowledge of something. Either we acquire it through our five senses, which is very clear, al-hawasu salima. And the reason why they said the sound five senses is, of course, it's because someone has a problem with their eyesight or their hearing, so forth and so on. They can't see things or hear things clearly. We won't say that they can conclude things properly because there's something wrong with their vision and there's something wrong with their hearing. And sometimes that impediment is temporary, sometimes it's permanent. Excuse. So that's one thing. So basically that sounds simplistic, but if we're using our minds, we can understand that that implies many things. So all the empirical knowledge that we have of science and any other type of knowledge that relies on empirical evidence is included in that category. So that's one thing. Moving to the next is what we call a khabar al-sadiq, that truthful narrations, and that is basically information. What they mean by that is information that we acquire from other people. And why do we need to acquire that information? Because these are things that we can neither observe directly because they happen in the past, for instance, or because they're beyond our sight, or whatever the reason may be. So we can't observe it directly, and we cannot rationalize it either. There are certain things that are beyond observation as well, but they're rational. So mathematics is one of those sciences. That's the next category, the third, which is that which is from the aql, or the rational sciences. So if it's not something we observe and it's not something we can rationalize, how do we conclude it? We know that certain people lived in the past not because we've met them or observed them in any way or saw them with our own two eyes. There's no evidence from that perspective. Neither can we just simply use our mind to conclude that such people existed. We know they exist because we were told, simply put. What's important about all that? The Sharia is based on the second category. The Sharia, in essence, means the laws and commandments of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu sent to us. It literally comes from a word that means the original word Sharia in Arabiya actually meant a path that leads to a watering hole. It's very interesting. Right? It has nothing to do with law or commandments. So how is it related? Because every technical word must have a relationship with its original or the original usage of the word in everyday language. It's related because the scholars say that the Sharia is a path that is led to lead us to that which gives us life in both worlds, spiritual life. Okay, in both worlds, meaning in this life, uh, obviously we are guided to that which is pleasing to God, and in the next life, all right, so that's what the Sharia means in essence, linguistically, and that's how it's related to the laws. Now, how it's become known today is simply from its law perspective, which is fine. But the important aspect is how do we arrive to that type of law? Because when we say Sharia, we're speaking on behalf of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. Is it something that we can rationalize? If we say that, then there's no point of having a prophet. We can just figure it out for ourselves. So obviously, we're not saying that. And also we would have to be very there's a little bit of hubris there to assume that every human being has enough intellect to conclude what it is that God intends. That's beyond hubris. That's kind of actually you have to be kind of crazy to assume that. So obviously we're not talking about the intellect, and we're not obviously also we're not talking about what you observe. Okay, because our observations alone cannot conclude moral issues. Okay, just by looking at things empirically, we cannot conclude issues of morality and ethics. So Sharia, its essence is what is basically that information which has been relayed to us. Why am I saying that? Because we have to remember at the end of the day, we derive our Sharia simply put from our tradition, what we've heard from others, what was relayed to us as an example from the Prophet ﷺ on behalf of Allah Himself, as well through the Quran, and because he was tasked with explaining it, as the Quran itself says, لِتُبَيِّنَ, right, that the explanation of the meanings of the Quran was tasked, or he was tasked, the Prophet ﷺ, with it. So therefore, we don't just take the Quran from him, we also take the explanation, which is called the Sunnah, and that also has to be relayed to us. So again, in other words, you can't rationalize these things. You can't conclude them through your rationale and your intellect alone. You weren't there to see the Prophet ﷺ or meet him, so you have no other recourse except to resort to what has been relayed to us. And that is a very important point. The Sharia, its origin, first and foremost, is what has been relayed to us. It's khabar. So we can't astray from that. That is its origin. No doubt the thubut of Allah and His attributes and His laws and commands is the what is relayed to us through khabar. But it's that, meaning how do we know its veracity? How do we understand it? And how do we apply it is no doubt through the intellect. Keep those two things in mind. The intellect has a purpose, no doubt, and its purpose is to verify and to understand and thereafter apply what has been relayed to us. I hope all that was very simple, and I tried to summarize that as very quickly as I can. Why is all that necessary to go over? Because a lot of the problems I find with many of these questions is that we're not really clear about those issues. Like where exactly and how exactly do we conclude things? The Sharia is not concluded strictly through the intellect, or excuse me, it's not proven strictly by the intellect or by what we observe. It is proven by what we have as information relayed to us from the time of the Prophet ﷺ all the way until now. Now, the discussion about how that happened and how it's preserved is a long one. Suffice it is that the Quran itself says, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun," that anyone who understands this ayah knows that this is a divine promise to protect all that was given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you want to use your logic, use it this way. If you say that there's something wrong with the tradition, that it did not protect what the Prophet ﷺ brought. And in essence, you're saying that the ayah is wrong also, that God's promise was not true. You have to remember that other prophets, if you look in the entire of the biblical, if you look throughout the Bible or any other tradition, I challenge you to find me one promise of God in those traditions to protect them. I challenge you to find one verse or anything like that verse I recited from the Quran that says that those traditions will be protected. And they weren't. And there's a reason for that, because they were only meant to be and for a particular period of time until the coming of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. So in other words, those prophets, the books and the commands they were given were only meant to be for a particular people or a particular time. Whereas the commandments of God given to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were meant to replace all of them and be for all of mankind. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. As Muslims, that should already be clear, but sometimes, again, we don't understand what that implies. It implies that don't compare yourself to the earlier traditions. They weren't meant to be kept around anyhow. They were meant to be changed at a particular point of time, particularly the coming of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they were not meant to be preserved anyhow, and God never promised to preserve them. Whereas our deen has been promised to be preserved, and it has been. So we should respect our tradition. Right? We should respect the fact that the preservation of the Quran and the Hadith and everything else revolving around the tradition, even the Arabic language. That's why I mentioned that many times, that the Arabic language, modern Arabic, is different from classical Arabic, and it would have gone through a complete change. We're only to thank Allah that in what is called the Fusha, or the language, the pure language of the Arab, is still preserved, meaning it is still used in things like, in news channels, for instance, or at least when you're educated in Arabic and you learn Nahu and Sarf and all these different sciences of the Arabic language, its grammar, its morphology, right? It's still preserved in that sense. What I mean by that is English changes a language, and also the rules of its grammar and everything else changed with it, okay? So Arabic could have gone through the same process. It's a human language after all. But you see there too, Allah had protected it. So I don't mean that the Quran alone is protected. Our deen is so beautiful that even some subsidiary subject related to the Quran, like the Arabic language, like tajweed, to the extent that even the pronunciation of letters have been kept preserved, which if you go and you try to study Hebrew, it's not the same. Okay, that has to be appreciated by us first and foremost. Do not disparage or reject the tradition. Appreciate it, understand that there's a divine protection under it, and we can see that historically too. And that is one of the things that actually this ummah should be proud of. With all of the other faults that we have, with all of the other problems that we may have, this is actually what has made us different. Not so much that we were perfect, but we had actually been honest and true academically. This is why we're called shuhada ala nas, because we have adala, and that's exactly what it means, that we did not change our deen, that we did not change our tradition, that no matter what happened throughout time, as a testimony to that, that we were not perfect, but we were truthful, we had been honest about our tradition and protecting it. That should be, first of all, I really think that's an important point, that we need to respect our tradition, and we have to give it its due, that this is a divine protection that happened, and it's still there, and it's still our challenge to this day, that no other deen was protected like this. No other deen was given this kind of attention, and we should be proud of that fact. Now, having said all
Imam,
that, yeah,
Imam, can you talk a little bit about the difference between preservation and infallibility, right? We believe the Quran
right.
is the perfect word. What's the difference in terms of an Aqidah standpoint between preservation and, I guess, maybe perfection, or I don't know what the right word is?
The ijaz or the mu'jiza of the Quran, you mean, like the miraculous nature of the Quran?
Or like you said, we have to respect that the Prophet's tradition has been
Right.
preserved.
Right.
But we know for a fact that there are, unfortunately, certain hadiths that have been manipulated and things
Sure.
like that. So what do you mean by preserve versus unchanged? Maybe that, is that a better word? Or
Preserve means exactly that, is that although there were attempts to manipulate things, those attempts fell short because all of those manipulations were clarified.
So in your opinion, but is that true? So in your opinion, not every hadith across the board by even the most prominent scholars across Islam is agreed upon. Is that true?
That's true, but we should sometimes understand that this is why part of what I wanted to say, because the reason why people may think I'm getting off of subject, but I'm not. If you pay attention, this is right on subject, because it has to do with the explanation of why riba is and isn't in certain cases halal and haram, because we're basing it off a law, and it's important to understand how we derive law. And a lot of the different things that I've been sent, articles and different things like that, and questions, they really revolve around the inability to understand the law itself and how we derive it. So basically, the Sharia, as I said before, basically your question about hadith is this, right? So it's not infallible, but it is preserved. Meaning that by that the vast majority and the bulk of hadith works if one studies it. This is the thing. Like you literally have to be a scholar who spends their time every day reading hadith literature and understanding it to get this point. If you read it and you're acquainted with it, you will understand that the vast body of those hadith that are present with us today have been reviewed and peer reviewed, so to speak, to such an extent that it's very hard to say that any hadith has been left out. Are there some hadith that scholars may disagree about its veracity or not? I would say yes, but they're not that first of all, they're not that great in number, and second of all, you still will see, like if you read a lot of these books, like all these books behind me, a lot of it is just repetition. What I mean by that is that the same hadith is repeated through different chains of narrations and the same message is being relayed. So in essence, whether some particular hadith are disagreed upon by certain scholars about the veracity or not, it doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of it has been accepted by scholars, and the hadith being repeated is important because what's being said here is that same message was carried on and accepted by a group of very particular scholars. Even the fact that, as I mentioned before you, that many scholars, what they had to do to take these hadith or let's say learn these hadith, it wasn't common knowledge, meaning hadith sciences were relegated to a very a group of people amongst the ummah. It wasn't every Muslim that was going out and listening to hadith. The proof and point is that I mentioned certain Sahaba who traveled for a whole year with their students and didn't mention one time one hadith. So how long did it take these scholars to even develop all this? You understand? So repetition, like if you take Bukhari's book alone, which is about 6,000 something or hadith, a lot of it are repetitions. So if you include the repetitions, you can actually take that number and almost take it to half of that. You understand? A lot of it are repetitions. So what does that mean? It means that the general body of hadith are pretty much so consistent. There's only very few hadith that are aberrant or different or maybe strayed somehow from two things: either the actual text of the hadith, the actual words of the Prophet ﷺ, or the chain of narration. Meaning, again, people even knew for the most part where these scholars were, who they were, and they did, and who they taught. Okay. So because of that, when a hadith is aberrant in that sense, they even have a word for it. It's called gharib, meaning that this is not a well-known hadith. You understand? This is not something, this is a very strange hadith. We've never heard it this way or said this way, and we've even never seen the scholars that narrated it. We've never heard them narrate this type of hadith. You understand my point? So what does that prove? If you take that on into consideration.
That a majority of it is agreed upon.
Right.
A vast majority.
The vast majority.
An overwhelming majority. Maybe
the overwhelming majority. Yeah. And that's why, again, like I don't want to get too long in the subject, but there's a hadith scholar's name was Ibn al-Salah, rahimahullah ta'ala. When he wrote his book of basically the Muqaddimah, what's famously called as his preface, is a book of hadith sciences. And he says in there, according to his opinion, that something that is muttafaqun alayh, which is a term we probably heard a lot. In other words, something that has been relayed both by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. In his opinion, he said that this is equivalent to something that is mutawatir. That was his opinion. You understand? Because I've used that word mutawatir a lot. So according to his opinion, and that was a scholarly opinion, that one who knows the hadith sciences and how these things work, if they see a hadith that is narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim, he can equate that hadith to being something that is mutawatir. It's well known enough that we can say that it gives us the same type of knowledge as something that is mutawatir. Okay, people have had scholarly discussions about that, but the point is that hadith scholars would know, and the more, like I said, you're familiar with hadith literature and how it works, the more that you would never be so bold as to say it's unreliable. That's very far from the truth. It is just as equivalent. It is preserved just as vigorously as the Quran itself. It's just that because of the larger body of hadith. Remember, there's more hadith than there are ayat of Quran, that we can find narrations that have some discrepancies or that have some differences of opinions. Okay, so I think that's important. People have really got this wrong, and that's very dangerous, because that's the next point I was going to make. Is that when you take an ayah, this is the ayah in question, right? Allah has made bay' or business transactions halal, and He has made riba haram. Now, what we've said in a couple classes before this, and I'll reiterate here, is that the word itself in the ayah, al-riba, is what is called mujmal, meaning that it is a very general term and it is not described in detail. That's literally what mujmal means. It's not ambiguous, but it's not necessarily described either, so that we would be kind of unaware in many certain situations what exactly is riba. Now, based on that, people use certain hadith to explain this ayah. We don't know exactly what is meant. In other words, we don't know in every case and in every scenario what is riba. It is, it's mujmal. It is a general word here used that we're not aware of every situation in particulars of when and where something could be riba. So why would we use hadith? Because I've seen some arguments that the hadith are used to by some fuqaha to prove that something is or is not riba. These hadith are khabar wahid. And because I've brought that up in other classes too, I think I need to kind of clarify very clearly, and I hope everyone will understand from today, what is meant when we say khabar wahid does not give us certainty. Okay, that statement of the scholars throughout time, all right, can give us sometimes a picture that is incorrect. They don't mean that you reject it. Okay, khabar wahid again is essentially, if you really want to break it down, is anything that is not mutawatir. Okay, and even if it's sahih, even if it's sound, like the hadith itself, the text is sound and the transmitters are reliable, then anything that is not mutawatir would be construed or called in technical terminology khabar wahid, which literally means the transmission of one person. Even though at times it can refer to a hadith that is transmitted by 3 people, actually. It'll still be called khabar wahid because according to scholars it's not mutawatir. I know this can be confusing, but try to follow me. So again, that's why I said, simply put, anything that's not mutawatir would be called khabar wahid. What they mean by that, it doesn't give us knowledge, they mean definitive knowledge. And what do we mean by definitive knowledge? We're categorizing something very clearly, something that cannot be disputed from any angle. It is a fact, if you will, what we would call fact, miyah fi miyah, right, 100%. What they mean by it doesn't give us knowledge is that it doesn't make us so certain that you cannot dispute the hadith, okay? However, disputing the hadith also has its own set of laws, because we say it's khabar wahid doesn't mean it's not a statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's just that there can be room for error in certain situations. Like, for instance, if it contradicts the Quran completely, okay? That's one example. Another example, are there other hadith like it that also have different meanings and contradict it? So in those cases, we obviously have to investigate further to see exactly what does it mean. But they're not trying to say that, first of all, the Prophet didn't say it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They're simply saying that there's still some room for consideration here before we make it into a definitive fact or law. Does that make sense? I mean, you can answer if you want.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so they're not saying that it's rejected or that you don't do anything about it. In fact, they say yujibu amal. They say that it is necessary for us to act on a khabar wahid. So we have to act on it. Why are they saying that? Go back to the original point. Where does the Sharia come from? Does it come from our intellect or does it come from the khabar?
Khabar.
Right. So you have two options here. If I'm confronted with an ayah like this, the riba, it's not really clear exactly what is and is not riba. I have two options. Either I'll rely on the narrations or I'll rely on my own intellect. Which the safer route?
Narration.
Right. Because by relying on intellect alone and rejecting narration, essentially what I'm doing is saying that my intellect is sufficient enough to determine divine law. You understand? And as Muslims, we already said in our epistemology, that's not how it works. Sharia is not determined by the intellect. Sharia is determined by divine law, which is only known through khabar. After all, God didn't speak to you, right? You understand? So basically, you have no recourse. In other words, it's always going to be, before we try to deduct anything, we have to first go to the ahadith, okay? And as long as those ahadith do not contradict what is being said, and there's other rules too, and this will become way too lengthy if I explain them in detail. For instance, if something is mujmal like this, like I say, as a very simple example, everyone comes to the trip with me. Or let's say, put it like this class, the 6th grade class is coming for a field trip, right? Now I can add to it, or I can subtract from that general statement of mine up until the point that that statement has no value. I hope that makes sense. So for instance, I can add to it, like I can start bringing 7th graders to the trip too, but if I bring the whole 7th grade, then my statement made no sense because I said the 6th grade will come on the field trip. Does that make sense? You can answer if you want.
Yes.
All right. And if I subtract, if I start taking so many students away that there's only one student left, that makes no sense either, because now the word has no meaning either. Why did I say the 6th grade is coming when I only meant one person? You see, so the statement itself has to retain its original meaning. In other words, if I say the 6th grade is coming for a field trip, I cannot add so many people that now that statement made no sense, because what I really meant was 6th and 7th grade. And I cannot subtract by it either, because it didn't make sense to say the 6th grade coming when I only meant one person. Okay, keep that in mind. This is just an example. So the word riba is used. It needs some explanation. What can you add and what you can subtract? The rule is you can add and subtract to it to the point and up until the point that the word itself retains its original meaning. Okay, that what you said made sense. So how will we add and subtract to explain it now? Because it does need explanation.
Hey, Imam, just a quick question.
Sure.
So in my understanding, when the Quran says something like that, that abstract, we at this moment may not know the exact meaning, right? Because we are like way after, the actual thing. But people, or the most of the people at that time, knew what the Quran was talking about, right? That was a common thing. They knew like what riba was, right? It's not
Right.
like we are trying to figure out now, but they knew what the riba was, right?
Sure. So yeah, I'll get to that in a second. So first thing, just keep that in mind, that the word itself, I wouldn't say abstract, because abstract would mean like it's really hard to understand. I would say that it wasn't, like I said, it's a very general word. That's why I said 6th grade, because 6th grade is very general, right? It
Yeah,
includes a lot of people.
yeah, it was general, but I mean abstract, I meant like general, but the people knew what exactly that meant at that time, at least, right?
Yeah, right. But that's why I'm just being very particular. I'm saying that if people knew what it meant, it's not abstract, basically. You know what I'm saying? That's all.
Yeah.
They knew what it meant, but they didn't know. Here's the difference. They didn't know the particulars of when and where something may be considered riba, because obviously, first of all, they had very specific transactions in their own culture, which they knew, right? Or they didn't call it riba, but it was now called riba by the Sharia. Like nasi'a. Nasi'a literally means, as we said, that's the primary, actually. If some hadith say, la riba illa fin nasi'a, there's actually hadith that say that there's no riba except in nasi'a. And remember, nasi'a was a transaction. Those are interest-bearing loans. In other words, again, the same example, I give you 2,000, but with the condition that when you pay me back, you give me 4,000. That was something they did. It was prominent in the time of Jahiliyyah, right? That's why the Prophet ﷺ said that the first the first nasiya or riba of nasiya that I absolve is that of Abbas, his own uncle, radiallahu anhu, because he did that a lot. Okay, you understand? So that was prominent, and the Prophet called it riba. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the Sharia now named this transaction or this type of transaction as riba. So although they knew what the word riba means, which simply put in language, it only means ziyada. It means an increase in something. Literally, the literal meaning of riba in language and linguistical use of the Arabs was to increase something. Okay, and that's why the Sharia needed to be explained. So the first explanation obviously will have to come from the lawgiver himself, and that is the hadith. So coming back to a principle, though, what I was trying to explain is that when you have a general statement like this, it can be specified by hadith so long as they don't contradict it, and so long as the hadith don't add or subtract to it in such a way that the original statement has no more meaning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So the hadith in question, it doesn't do that. Like, for instance, the hadith I just mentioned, La riba illa fin nasiya. So there's no riba. And again, this statement is very strong because it's like saying that riba is only in those things which are nasiya, another interest-bearing loans. You understand what I'm saying? So if that hadith is actually an explanation of riba, it is neither subtracting or adding to that meaning in a way that the word itself has no, it doesn't retain its original meaning. So therefore we can accept, even if it's khabar wahid, that's the important part, even if it's khabar wahid, because it doesn't contradict it, it doesn't add or subtract anything to it, that its original meaning is lost. In fact, it explains. This is tafsir, it's mufassil. It explains in more detail what is riba. So that's clear, right?
So a quick question in this regard: can we
Right.
make a khabre wahid? Can we make a law, a Sharia, based on not just khabre wahid? Because the khabre wahid could be very specific to the situation, right? And if it was like more like a Sharia or a Deen, then it should come to us as a matwater, right? Not just a khabre wahid, because khabre wahid could be like very specific to that situation only, and who knows, what the situation was.
Yeah, but that's true. But that's also that. This is the whole point. What I was mentioning before is that there's other things to consider. Number one is that in order to ascertain that, you have to study the actual context anyhow, right? That when and where this was said and why it was said. And the other thing is too is that khabr wahid will. This is the point I'm making. It will take a precedence if we have no other evidence. And we need to have evidence. Like in this case, we don't have any other evidence to the Quran itself does not explain this word, for instance, like in detail. And we cannot, and so we only have two choices. Either we're going to explain it through khabr wahid, or we're going to explain it using our own rationale. So what will we do in that case?
So we will use the khabre wahid,
Right.
kind of drive the principle according, with the in the light of Quran, and then
Right.
using the intellect we will apply on our current situation, right? So it's a mix of
Exactly.
everything, right?
Exactly.
It's not just
Exactly.
taking khabre wahid and blindly applying something on the current situation, right?
Right. No, in order to apply it to the current situation, you take what you know from this information in the Sharia, meaning the ayah itself, and for instance, the hadith, whether they're khabr wahid or not, and then you do qiyas. That is the rational deduction that you can use
Exactly. So we still do
from
the
there.
qiyas. Yeah.
Right. Of course, we have to at times because again, we're living in a context where it's not at all the same to when the Prophet ﷺ was alive. Certain principles are. And so the principles have to be derived, and that's what we call illa, meaning what's the reasoning behind the hurma of this transaction. Got it? What's the reasoning behind it? So the reasoning is simple. The reasoning is that if you are earning, in other words, riba means here ziyada, you're getting more without any fair exchange. That's the reasoning. You got it?
Okay.
It's very simple. I am taking, in other words, an extra amount of what would normally be earned in any transaction. More specifically, though, again, this is why I mentioned what are the three things that we're talking about when we're talking about like the transactions that include that are constituted as riba. Something where the value of it is understood by its weight or its volume. right? Or it's of the same kind. We understand that point, right? That's
Yeah.
important. So if I am getting more, but I have not given any fair exchange, and we can even take that now into the market value. You know how now that's the big thing, fair exchange, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a term now that's used, fair exchange. There's no exploitation. That is primarily the same thought process and reasoning in the Sharia, that there's no exploitation. The reason why nasi'a, or these interest-bearing loans, because I can't think of a better word for it, why is that considered exploitation? Because you haven't done anything. You simply gave someone a loan of $2,000 and you stipulated at the very beginning. So that's important. At the very beginning, you said that, okay, I give this to you on the condition that you give me 4,000 back. What did you do for that extra 2,000?
But Imam, isn't that so subjective? Like, for example, when
Hmm.
you go to a restaurant
Right,
and you are getting a meal and they put some broccoli in front of you that you know cost 18 cents and they're
right,
charging $18.
right.
So in terms of the spirit, what's the difference there?
Because there is an exchange of something for something. In other words, first of all, is it the same type of thing? Your money, your currency for a plate of broccoli.
No,
Okay. You see what I'm saying?
I
Second of
see.
all,
I see.
you're also not, and in any restaurant, they're not just charging you for the broccoli. They're going to say that we're also charging you for services, for the,
Sure, sure,
you understand?
sure.
Now that maybe is where the other question came from some people about mortgages, right?
No,
Am I
but
right?
before we go that, so that's the one side of the coin, right? The
Right,
person who is giving the riba. But I
right.
thought the actual illa for making it forbidden was, you are exploiting the other person because that person is in need,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
And
that's what exactly that's right. That's what I thought I made clear. But you're right. There's an exploitation there again in that case too, because the person has a need, and you're not doing anything other than loaning them some money, for instance, that you happen to have, and you're taking advantage of the situation by saying that okay, an extra 2,000 when you pay me back, right? That's the exploitation point of it, exactly what you said. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ in some cases was reported to have said, La riba illa fin nasiya, that riba really doesn't exist except in this kind of transaction.
yeah,
Okay?
so what I meant was, when you are kind of investing in such some situation, you may not be doing anything. You maybe like a sleeping partner or something, and you are still getting some profit, right? So
Yeah.
taking like more money in some scenario is gonna be okay, but exploiting someone is not okay, and that is the main reason it's not permissible, right? I mean, that's kind of what.
That's the illah, right?
Yeah,
That's
that's
the
the illa, right?
reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Now, the other issue, having said all that, I came back to the one point where is that the second point, rather, sorry, that the fuqaha, originally the jurists, do have a different opinion, a difference of opinion about a very particular issue, right? And that is what is called Darul Harb, which, without getting the explanation detailed about what that is, we can pretty much so say that, we're living in that type of situation. To just put it briefly, any land where the Sharia is not applicable. Okay, you understand?
Yeah, yeah,
So there we are.
yeah, yeah. We
Okay,
cannot.
so
Yeah,
right. So in that situation, according to Imam Abu Hanifa and his student Imam Muhammad, rahimahullah ta'ala, they gave a very clear fatwa that, in that situation, there is no riba, or rather that, in that situation, you can for instance, like you said, you can have these kind of transactions where, I can um, give out a loan and take back more than what I gave in that kind of situation. Okay, that's
okay, okay.
permissible
So, so,
according to.
so, so here looks like, you are saying, Imam Abu Hanifa and his student kind of allowing this riba. But the question, original question was, is the transaction that we do with the home mortgage or car loan, because we are getting some commodity which is not perishable, and
Right.
it's gonna retain its value, and in some cases, you know, the value is gonna go up, right? So there is no exploitation also, right? So it's in most of the situation, it's win-win for both the parties, right? So,
Yeah.
the original question was, is that a riba? So allowing riba is, you know, something else, as you mentioned, you know, in
Yeah.
Darul Arab, or maybe, you know, here in USA, even
Mhm.
doing a business with riba is okay. But is this mortgage and car financing is under the
Is it
same?
riba or not? Right.
Yeah,
So that's very subjective, right? So for instance, what you just said, like a home can go up in value, but as soon as you take the car off the lot, its value drops,
yeah,
right?
but you are using the car
Right.
also, right? You're using the facility, right?
That's true. You are taking benefit from it. And also, many banks will say that they charge interest on their loans because of their own, because they have to give out other loans as well, and they need that money and so forth and so on. So it's subjective, right? Even the answers I've seen from some scholars who refuse to allow mortgages, they seem very subjective too. Like I've literally read this from a mufti who will remain nameless, that the reason why he still will not allow mortgages is because this is how the Rothschilds have like ruled the world by using interest-based bank loans. And okay,
Yeah, so that it's not
that's
more like, you know, they are giving a
that's not
valid
a right.
principle in the deen. They are just making something up, right?
Right. That's not, I mean, I found that to be very sad because I respect the person. And I think that was just reaching out for any answer, really, because that was like, that's not only is that it's subjective, that's almost borderline to some people, almost conspiracy theory, even if I agree, right? But that's not how you make Sharia. Okay. So, yeah, I think that you have a point there, that it could be very subjective in the sense that, okay, is it completely the type of riba that the Sharia has prohibited? And Allah knows best. That's why I predicated the first class that we have with, at the end of the day, you have to go with that which, uh, that your heart has itminan in. Okay? You
Oh,
understand?
yeah, yeah. So fine.
Because you will find many differences of opinions, and the issue itself becomes, the more detailed we go into it, it becomes at times very subjective, right? So I would believe that if the Sharia has given us some rukhsa, as in the case that even if you're not Hanafi in fiqh, but Imam Abu Hanifa and his student has given this fatwa, there's room there, and we have other angles that we look at it from to say that, well, is this completely the same type of interest that the Sharia has prohibited? If you don't feel comfortable still, that's fine. You can follow your heart and do your best to live that way. And if not, then, the dispensation is there. We hope Allah forgives us if we are wrong,
Um,
right?
I mean, yeah,
But
that's the main point.
if it's there, it is there, because there's other aspects to this as well, which is that, again, we're kind of caught in a situation where, uh, not to go off course from something that's not really a dini discussion, so to speak, but even the greatest some of the most critical thinkers of capitalism themselves, like Noam Chomsky, right? He recently said too that right now you can't replace that system. It's just too big, too far wide reached. I mean, what are you going to do? If you want to replace the system, you have to have something better than it or like it, right?
Yeah,
So what are you going to do, really, instead of just reaching up for fancy dreams of revolution and saying that we're going to change the world? That's great. I maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, I don't know. But right now that system is too well entrenched and too far wide reaching and powerful for us to just replace it overnight. It's not going to happen. So at that point in time, and he's a great critic of capitalism, and he's one of the most intellectual people, according to some, in our time, Noam Chomsky, and even he admits that there's no replacing that system right now. We're in it. So basically, in that situation, the best that we can do is to live within it as best as we can, within somehow the regulations of Sharia as best as we can. And one aspect of that too, because I spoke to some other scholars about this detail, because there was other questions too I had about even the fatwa of Imam Abu Hanifa, as the one that you had, for instance, that is it only in giving and not taking, or is it, you understand?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Is it only taking it and not
yeah,
giving?
yeah,
And
yeah.
his response was that, well, both are considered haram, So if you're going to give a jawaz for one, you have to give jawaz for both. You understand?
Yep.
So if one is, if it's both, that was his response. And the other aspect of it, and what I'm getting to in this point too, is that when living in such a situation, you have to understand that certain ahkam and laws of the Sharia can only be applicable when there is an authority to enforce them. You got it?
Yep.
So in our case, that's why I said Darul Harb is that land where the Sharia is not applicable. So we don't have any authority that is going to watch the market or watch the banks and make sure that they don't take riba. You got it?
Yep.
Who's there to do that? Who's going to do that? Is it a law? Can we make it law? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not there. So in such a situation, what are you going to do? You see? So you only have two options. You have basically at this point in time, you can take those scholarly opinions that say that no, under no circumstances are these mortgages halal. Do your best. I make dua for you. Right? Or that you can take the other scholarly opinions that give you that rukhsa, which we've explained a lot of it in these past two classes, right? And you
Nice.
make dua, right? So that Allah accepts. That's up to the individual. We can do our best to explain why, and I think we've kind of done that so far. We've kind of given the reasoning behind the Sharia of prohibiting riba, the opinions of different fuqaha and scholars of why they give the permission in this scenario. I think that's pretty clear. What it boils down to at that point is the individual's choice of which side they're going to take. Now, even if you take the side of extra wara and taqwa and say, okay, I'm not going to take a mortgage just to be safe, I don't think mortgages are as hard as, because you can just rent for the rest of your life if that's what you want to do, right? But when it comes to things like when your kids have to go to school, right? I don't care how much money we have, not a lot of us are going to be able to find just $70,000 around somewhere to pay for our child's education. Is that true or not? You
True.
understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's going to be a difficult one. I don't know many people just have 70,000 like that just can spend all it. Just say, hey, I want my child to go to a good school, and I don't want to take any loans, so here it is. It's difficult. I mean, if you could try and do it, but that will be a very difficult thing to do for most people. I think that probably in such a scenario, take the rukhsa, take the dispensation. And I would say it's not even a dispensation because it is a very clear fatwa. It's there. Agree with it or not. We've explained the reasoning behind it. And one more thing I would like to add to that too, from the original discussion, is that there is a khabar also. So the khabar, as I mentioned before, is on the authority of Makhul, rahimahullah ta'ala, is a very famous tabi'i. He attributed it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where the statement is very clear: La riba بين المسلم والحرب في دار الحرب, or لا ربا في دار الحرب, something along that line. That literally, there is no riba at all. I mean, if you take the literal meaning of the Arabic there, it's the same la that we use in la ilaha illallah. It's called la nafil jins. So its literal meaning would be that there is no such thing as riba. Just like when you say la ilaha, you say there is nobody worthy of worship. You're denying completely that there is anyone worthy of worship. It's the same la. So it's literally saying that there is no such thing as riba in that scenario. Okay, and that is important to remember, because remember when we said you have khabar and you have qiyas, which one takes a precedence, right? So even if that khabar is like disputable by some scholars whether it's sound or not, but again the principle is when you are when you're confronted with a situation where you don't have an explanation of an issue and you have khabar or qiyas, it's better to take a khabar even if it's somewhat weak than it is to resort to qiyas. Okay, and I just wanted to mention that in the end, that fatwa is not just a rukhsa. There is reasoning behind it, and there's even some textual evidence, even if it's weak, to support it. So we cannot, if we don't want to follow it because of our own personal feelings that I don't feel too comfortable with that fatwa, that's fine, but we cannot just,
All right.
yes.
So brother, just to recap, so looks like, it's not very clear, right, from the implementation, or from, finding out whether, this house financing or car financing actually has a riba, right? As you
Right.
mentioned, go with your heart. And you also mentioned there is a fatwa, right, which actually give us, this kind of uh, permission to do this kind of transaction, even, it's a qualified riba thing. And then, you mentioned there is a hadith, because it's a darul harb and there is no riba in darul harb, right? So based
Right.
on all what we discussed, and we have been talking also, looks like, we can do this kind of transaction, the kind of transaction we do here to get the car and mortgage. I'm just trying to, I'm not saying like you should give a fatwa or something, or nobody should give a fatwa, right? But
Right.
looks
Right. Right.
like,
Unless they're qualified to.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
right.
So
The
based on
synopsis
the
is,
discussion, looks like, it's okay to have this kind of transaction.
well, let's put the talkhis is this, is that in essence, again, as we said in the very beginning, the word riba is a very general word that's used in the Quran, and it needs explanation. During the process of that explanation, we described how we do it. We can use khabar wahid, we can use qiyas, right? That works. At the end of the day, what happens is that there's bound to be differences of opinion, because in that analysis, there's going to be different circumstances, and there's going to be different fatawas and given, and that's actually a mercy from Allah, because then a person is able to choose at that point of time the one that they think it makes the most sense to them, and also they feel comfortable with it. That's why I mentioned in the beginning all those hadith about following what your heart tells you at the end of the day. So in reality, it is a mercy from Allah that those differences of opinions are there, because it allows a person to make that choice and feel comfortable with that choice, that okay, it's not that black and white, whereas if I do this I'm doomed because
Yeah.
I'm taking riba, and Allah has announced war upon those who use riba, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have to feel that way,
Yeah.
right? So in
That's,
essence, it comes down to that.
that's a
Um,
great point.
it really comes down to that point. You have, and again, the reason why I didn't use the word, I shouldn't have used the word rukhsa. It's not a dispensation, because it is a fatwa that's there. Agree with it or not, don't want to follow it, and you're not comfortable with it, but it is there. And the fatwa has some basis. It's not just out of the thin air. That's why I mentioned this hadith of
Yeah.
Makhul, rahimahullah ta'ala, even though, again, some scholars have criticized that hadith, but there is a narration there. It's not from the thin blue air that Imam Abu Hanifa pulled this out, rahimahullah ta'ala. So because that's there, a person, if they feel the need, they can take recourse to it, and without having to feel, again, like you said, guilty completely that I've done something so grievous, right? Um, you know, and that's just my own, this is a disclaimer, my own personal opinion
Yeah.
is that it would make more sense based on the fact that, again, it's kind of a system that we really can't work ourselves out of unless you want to live a really interesting life. Right? Like people who want to get off the grid and all of that, mashallah,
Yeah.
that's great. If you can do it, more power to you. I hope Allah Ta'ala makes it easy for you. But if you're going to live a somewhat normal life, there's almost like no way really out of it. Right? And in certain cases, you're going to be paying it even if you don't want to. So if I don't take mortgages, I don't pay car loans, but I pay for life insurance or car insurance, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Exactly.
At some point in time, it's there. So I would just say to people like that, if you really want to be that cautious, more power to you. I'm not critical of you, but I think it's a very difficult thing to expect the entire Muslim community to live like that.
Okay.
Do you
Jazakumullah
understand what
khair,
I'm
brother.
saying?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It all makes sense. And there is one question. Uh, yeah. Please go ahead, Sister Smeen. It's in the chat. It's
Okay, yeah, I did see. Let me just look at it again. So wow, yeah, Allah. Okay, let me check it again.
it's about the wudu. If we are
Yes.
at home all the day and have to remake wudu to do, we have to wash our feet, or can we just wipe over them? Like, can we just do masa instead of washing it
Yeah,
off
yeah.
completely?
Masha has the stipulation of masha is not being at home or not. Has nothing to do with that. The only difference is that if you're traveling, you have 3 days to do it, whereas meaning you can make masha over You can make masah if you're traveling for 3 days, but if you're at home, you can only do it for an entire day. The issue of what you can and cannot make masah, however, I'm not going to explain right now, but that's the issue in general, is that at home, the stipulation is not there that you have to be traveling. You can be at home and making masah, but it's only for the duration of 24 hours. Is understood?
Yes,
Okay.
brother.
Okay, great.
Alhamdulillah, very good. Okay, quickly, Bismillah, let's do it. If you have time, if anyone needs to leave, you can leave, that's no problem. But Bismillah.
Yeah, Brother Shazad, go ahead and ask question, please.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is Shazad.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Walaikum salam.
I just have two questions about the same subject. One is, I don't know, Imam, what do you think about the Islamic financing? Would you have a different opinion about that, or would you have the same opinion like you said about any other mortgage?
Yeah. I mean, it is different, although it seems to be the same. But there is a slight difference, and the difference is basically in the wording, all right, in the contract itself. The wording of the contract itself is what makes it different. Okay, what's called mudaraba in Arabic, that's the concept that they're using for these kinds of Islamic financing. And again, I say that, you can criticize it, but it is slightly different just because the wording and the contract is different. Okay. And you're basically buying somebody else's a shared property. So you're buying your portion from them. You've probably seen this before, right? You've researched it?
A little bit, yeah. I used it once too. I wasn't sure if
yeah.
it's the same thing or a little different.
Right. So the difference is that instead of just paying an interest or interest on the loan, instead the wording is that you're buying that portion from a co-owner. So the bank in this case is the co-owner, and that's what would not make it riba in that case.
Gotcha. And the second question is, some of the scholars I heard they said it's. I heard your opinion, and that's I understood it. But some scholars said it's okay to use this mortgage once for the house or for your own need for the car, but you should not make it a routine. You shouldn't be going around and buying more houses and getting, you shouldn't be making them a business. What's your opinion about that?
Right. I forgot to add that. I mean, I did mention it briefly in the last class we had, but yeah. So basically what they're saying is that, according to your need and to not go above and beyond that. My opinion would be, again, that, yeah, that's a great thing to do because of basically just taqwa, right? Just to be as observant as you can of Allah's commandments and to not get into any gray areas. So take the dispensation in this case, meaning that you're not just looking at it from the perspective of being in a non-Sharia compliant land where the laws are not according to Sharia. You're also looking at it as another aspect of durura, which means it's my necessity. These are the ways that they do things here. I will take that as according to my need and not more. So yes, that is a part of what they stipulate as well. And so I would advise probably to do the same thing, just out of taqwa. That don't make this a habit of, don't take a credit card out and buy all kinds of useless things and. Right.
Thank you.
But right. Make sure that what you're doing it for is for something that is actually needed. Okay. Inshallah. Like a home,
Thank you.
a car, and so forth. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much, guys. Any last question?
I have a quick question with regard to the Islamic financing. One thing that never made sense to me, if the bank is a co-owner, and for example, if you take a standard mortgage and the price of your home drops, and you are still responsible for the entirety of the mortgage, but if the bank in Islamic financing is a co-owner and the price of the property drops, do they share in that loss with you? If that is the case, then it's truly different. If it's not, then it seems like semantics.
SubhanAllah. That's a very good question because I never looked at it from that angle before. And I would highly doubt that a bank would take that loss. No offense, right? That's very doubtful. They must have. I'm
No, no,
gonna
they are
have.
not.
They
Yeah,
don't.
this is
Okay.
for sure that they are not, because I
They,
have a
Okay.
self-financing, and they
Okay.
clearly said that we are not going to take that any loss.
yeah, the bank never takes any loss.
Right.
You know, they even have they have some kind of chance they will take a some kind of insurance on that. They never take.
Right. There's no way I would have imagined that any one of these banks would take that loss. So yeah, see, that's why I think a lot of people in general have some questions about this Islamic financing and really what is the difference. There's a difference in semantics. You're right about that, and that's what basically makes it a quote unquote halal interaction at that point in time. So it goes back to me for the same original issue. If there's a fatwa there, if you don't want to take it, that's fine. But if it's there, why not? Because you can't really get around it 100%, right? As in this scenario, right? No bank is going to take a loss like that as a co-owner, right? They're not going to say, "Oh, well, we're with you, pal." No, it doesn't work. Banks don't work that way, right? So, what's really at that point in time the difference, except in semantics? And some scholars will say, well, yeah, that's true. It's only in semantics at that point in time, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Which again, if you want to follow that opinion, I'm not going to dismiss it or be dismissive of it. But that's what it is. Again, same point. It comes down to that you have to be able to follow one of these two opinions with a certain amount of itminan in your own heart, and to be practical as well. So what I mean by that, and I hope this will be the last point of today, being practical means that considering the community at large, what exactly do we want to see in our community? Because I've seen people, as my teacher said too, like there's certain situations in North America, in places like Canada and even in New York City and Chicago, where some portions of the Muslim population have become quote unquote ghettoized because they're taking very stringent fatwas about this issue. And I don't know if that's really helpful to the ummah. Allah knows best, and some of these people who have been ghettoized, so to speak, are actually making a decent salary. They're not poor by any means, but they just, they're just decided to be as cautious as they can in this issue, and the result is that a lot of their life becomes unnecessarily difficult. So again, I'm not at all a proponent of the whole system that we're living in. It has its flaws, but it is what it is, and like Noam Chomsky said, it's no replacing it anytime soon. So we're going to have to kind of find a way of living within it as much as we can within the parameters of our Sharia. And that's why, to conclude again, you have those two different opinions. You really need to kind of make it something personal at that point in time. The fatwa are out there. Those opinions are out there. We've talked about them. We heard them. So at that point of time, you yourself as an individual have to make that decision, based on your own feelings about it. Okay. And it's very rare that any scholar will say that, right? But that's what it boils down to at this point of time, that your own personal comfortability with this issue has to be there. And you should consider, of course, other things like the community or your own family, and right, what will really affect you in good or bad ways, and of course your akhirah. But the good news is this, I'll leave at this point so we can all feel like, there is a famous hadith of Sahih Muslim and others where the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا الْحَكَمَ الْحَاكِمُ فَاجْتَهَدَ, when a judge sits to judge and he makes his best effort to come to a conclusion, if he's right, he gets two rewards, one for being right and one for making the effort, for its ijtihad. The literal word in the Arabic that's used in the hadith, ijtihada. So he made the ijtihad to the best of his knowledge that he had. He considered the issue, he went deep into it, and he made a conclusion. If he's right, he gets two rewards. Falahu ajran. Now, the important thing about reward that is mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, this is for in the akhirah, not here. So the point I'm making is, even when we consider our akhirah, remember this hadith, that person, that scholar, is rewarded twice in the akhirah, once for their effort and once for being right. But even if they're mistaken, the Prophet ﷺ still said they get one reward, ajr. So they will still be rewarded in the hereafter, even if they're wrong for their effort. Why am I saying that? if we don't have that kind of scholarship and we're following scholars' opinions, if they're being rewarded for it, you think you're going to be punished for it, even if they're mistaken? You understand my question?
Yep.
Right?
Makes perfect sense. Yeah.
That would make no sense. That the followers who didn't have that ability, they simply followed the expertise. Even that person was wrong, but Allah is rewarding them still for the effort.
Yeah.
How would the followers be punished? Right? So, don't get too just, if take an opinion, feel itminan, don't worry about it and make dua. Basically, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, brothers. And
Alhamdulillah.
thank you everyone for joining. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.